Welcome back. I'm glad to see you've all come back. This is where we got up to yesterday. Soldered in the bearings, folded up the chassis, sweated together the sole bars and soldered them onto the chassis. So what I want to come on to next is probably what a lot of people think is one of the most difficult parts of these kinds of wagon constructions, and that's the axle boxes. We've got 3 layers of etch here. Again, like the sole bars, they're joined together with tabs, so we're not going to cut out each individual layer, cut them out as one thing and fold them up concertina fashion. And hopefully when they've all gone together and are soldered, they'll end up looking something like this tiny little thing here, with the ridge that goes all the way around all lined up and perfect. Now, when it comes to putting these on, we're kind of like up in the air now and there's no support under here. So we need to support this somehow. And a lot of people, for this reason, prefer to build all the layers up while the chassis is still flat. If I go back to an early version that we were looking at yesterday, put the sole bar overlays on and build the things up and then fold the chassis up. I don't do that because to me, it's more important to get this top really smooth and really level, because nothing's worse, well actually there's lots of things worse than having a wagon with a big unsightly gap between the top of the sole bar and the floor because you're not lined it up. And if you're doing it flat, it's not impossible, but it's harder, I find, to line it up. So we need some way of supporting the underneath of this axle guard while we build up the axle boxes on it. Now you can sort of make a stack of bits of hardboard and get your soldering board over the edge and put it round like that and rest it on it, and you'd have to clamp several layers of hardboard onto the bench. But I have a special jig for doing this, and it's one that I got from David Evely, an association member. He's not with us tonight that I know of, but it's called his Orion jig. And it's very simple to build. He built this one for me, but you could build one for yourself. A couple of layers of board, a thick sheet of MDF on the top, and some vertical bits of wood, top and side, to build things against. What's really nice about these is that these are a right angle, and somewhere my square has disappeared. I'll use the end of a ruler instead and check that David's built this right. It is a right angle there. So it helps to get things square. But it has a secret weapon, and the secret weapon is this thing on the end, a lolly stick with 2 screws through it, and one screw is a hinge, and it opens up like this, and you put your wagon chassis on the end, and the lolly stick flips around, clamps it in place, and then you can work on the board with the wagon in the flat and fold it up at the same time. Genius, hey? You can see all the scorch marks along here where I've been soldering wagons on this. And David, he's got a website, Evely Creations. He calls these Orion jigs because he puts the holes, and these holes are for little wooden pegs and things to go into clamp things, in the shape of the constellation of Orion, except on mine, the stars were not aligned for me. And this is the Big Dipper, or Ursa Major, part of it anyway. And I'm going to use that to put the axle boxes onto here. But we're not there yet. We're not ready for that yet. We've got to make the axle boxes first. So we'll go back to the etch and we'll cut out the first axle box. And this is where my heart is in my mouth. And you notice I'm actually cutting this on the Tresper now, rather than cutting it on the hardboard that I used for cutting out yesterday. And that's because these are half etched, and I want to cut right up to the edge of the part. And if I cut them on the hardboard, it's too soft. It would just bend these things. And if they get bent, they're more difficult to solder up. So I'll just do one for now, and then turn it over to get the other side through the half etch. And yesterday, I showed you the method with the sole bars of where I tinned the parts and then folded them up and put heat in from the edge to sweat them together and heat from the back to sweat them together. This time I'm going to do it the other method, as I promised, where I'm going to fold these up kind of like a sandwich with flux in the middle. So first off, it's probably easiest to do these in fingers than in tweezers. I'll fold them into kind of Z shape like this. There we go. That's the initial stage. And then with my paste flux on the end of a cocktail stick as before, I can go in here and put some flux on the inside of these. And you do get this on your fingers. It's not, so I've got flux in between those layers now. And then it's a case of squeezing them up carefully. Now, there they are all folded up. Holding it at the sides, keep these layers of etch in line from side to side, and then push down on top to squeeze up those hinges and make them flat. And what this will probably do, they'll not stay perfectly in shape, have the tendency of squeezing out of line top to bottom. So I can go back in and squeeze them up again top to bottom. Do it from both sides and make sure that these are in line. Once you've got it in line and you've pressed down where the hinges are, it'll hold the position that it's in. And it's probably worth then just picking up in the tweezers and inspecting from the side and making sure that the line of ridges down the side is in line and is perpendicular to the base of these etches. So that's there now, and it's got flux in between. And I'm going to introduce solder from the sides on the iron. So as I've done several times yesterday, get a little salami slice of solder here and get my iron and give it a good stabbing in my tip cleaner. The oxidized, I've not used it for a while. I'm going to pick the solder up on the iron and then hold this down with my tweezers and put the iron into the side and try and get this solder to flow between the layers, not all over the top of the axle box. And it carries in by the flux. You can see the flux oozing out. And if I turn this round and hold it down again, I can then put the iron on the other side, and that will then draw the solder through the layers towards it, and I can see it coming shiny out the other side. So the solder will go towards the heat source, and so that's a good solid sandwich there. And this axle box now, it's got these little tags, the hinges top and bottom, and I'm going to leave them in place until it's soldered on the wagon chassis. If I cut them off now, what will probably happen is, as it goes on the wagon chassis, these layers will move and it'll all go in a million different directions, and there'll be much weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth. And of course, in the kit, you get 4, you don't get any spares. So if I bring in the chassis on my Orion jig now, what I need to do is I need to align this over one of these axle boxes. In fact, probably, so again, flux, and because this flux is sticky, it'll help things stick in place. Remember yesterday, we filed off the turning pips of the axle bearings, so they weren't going to stop the axle box sitting down. If you can see the inside of this, probably not in focus, that bottom layer with the hole in it is now a dimple, which will line up over here. But again, because it's not exactly the right size, it's generously sized. When it comes to lining it up, it's quite tricky. It doesn't just fit where it needs to be, it can move around a bit. So I've got 2 pairs of tweezers, and you really need 2 pairs of tweezers to do this. I'm sort of holding it down with one and nudging it around with the other, and feeling the sides of these ridges because they go up from the bottom layer to the top layer, and just nudge it around until you're happy that everything's in line. And of course, there's no shame, if you want to, in using magnification to help you do this. So in with the solder, and this is where it'll move, and I'll have to line it up again. So there's a bit of solder ready to go on, and you can, if you want, put in an extra bit of flux. I'm just going to get my little tweezers back and hold that down. Just a bit of flux on the side there, and pick up the solder so the iron's wet, and then just touch it to the side. Touch it onto the bottom of the axle guard and just let that solder flow all around, and you'll hear this hissing and fizzing, and that's gone in now, and it's not made a mess because I controlled the amount of solder that was on there. If I just turn it round, maybe the light will reflect in a different place, you can see. And on the other side, what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw the solder through. So I'll get a bit more flux, generous bit of flux, and just put this on the other side. And again, hold this down and then put my iron without any more solder onto this side. And the solder that's in there will come out and flow through. And anything that wasn't quite soldered on properly before, because when we put the sol bar overlays on, remember we didn't tin down the axle guards, I'll bring the solder through and everything will now be soldered up really nicely. So I shall take this out of the jig. So there it is. I think it's in line. If you can see the end, you can see we've now got 5 layers of etch on top of the axle guard, and where it comes in there, those little lumps going out are all perfectly in line. So you can take your time lining it up, and the thing to do, you can see the other side's in line as well, is get it in place and hold it down, put pressure with your tweezers directly on top. Now I do abuse my tweezers, I have to say. They're stainless steel, so they won't get soldered, but I consider them kind of consumable equipment as far as making models is concerned. This pair here have been in use for a few years, and the blades have gone soft because they've been heated up so much. Put this back in the Orion jig for this. There's one last thing we need to do. We need to go in with a scalpel, and where those hinges are, just chop down, and they'll clunk away, top and bottom. And then, finally, with my horriblest file, this is the one I showed you yesterday, the cheap Chinese one. It's actually very useful because it's got one edge which is blind, it's got no teeth on this edge. And also, the shape of it, if you look at it end on, it's not quite rectangular, it's more of a parallelogram. It was badly formed, but that gives me a sort of sharp blind corner here, and I can go in with the file, and the top and the bottom where those tabs were, I can file them smooth, and it just makes it look nicer if you take a couple of minutes to do that. Probably easier actually if you've got both axle boxes on one side soldered in place, because then you can rest it against both of them. When you've done that, you get a nice smooth shiny top and bottom, and any place where the layers of the etch had sort of slipped out of registration, you file them back into registration, which helps quite a lot. So there, that's that one. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to cheat, and I'm going to say, here's one that I did earlier. I did this yesterday afternoon, which has got all 4 axle boxes in place, just for the expedient of saving time. The next thing we need to think about is the brakes. Now, as I mentioned yesterday, this kit allows you to build either 2-shoe or 4-shoe Morton brakes. We removed the tie rod because we weren't going to make 4-shoe vacuum brakes. So this bit with the brakes on the etch, we need to chop out and cut off some of the brakes and the bit where the vacuum cylinder can fit. So cut out, get it the right way up to see where the half-etched tabs are. And there's a little extra piece stuck on the side of here that spaces the pieces apart. Okay, now these brakes are handed. With Morton brakes, they sort of change direction across the side of the wagon, so you have to cut off the right hand. And to help you, they only fit onto the Wagon chassis one way round anyway, because these little tags, these tabs fit into slots in the Wagon floor, and one end is long and one end is short. So the one we want to get rid of is this side, the side next to the vacuum cylinder. This is a little locating point for a turned vacuum cylinder if you're going to put one on. So just hold the bit that I'm going to snap off in the pliers and bend it backwards and forwards 2 or 3 or 4 times, and that goes away. And I can also do the same thing with this tag for the vacuum cylinder, because that's surplus to our requirements. And with all these things, it's useful to go round and file off the remains of any tags and so on as we're going round. And while I've been talking about files, I've shown you my horrible file. I've shown you my nice file. This is a number 4 cut. I might as well show you another file as well. This is my super nice file, and this is a number 6 cut watchmaker's files. The cut refers to the size of the teeth. The higher the number, the finer the teeth. They do go up to number 8 cut. This number 6 one is very, very fine. I don't let it anywhere near solder. This number 4 cut is my workaday file that I use for pretty much everything. And this is a number 2 cut. I think it doesn't specify, but it's definitely more coarse than the number 4. And it's just, it might even be a number 0 cut, actually, this one. But it's anything with solder and nastiness on, this one gets used for. Because if I need to and stuff gets clogged in it, I can pick gunge out of the teeth, but these are too fine for me to do that. So this is best file for number 6 cut. For delicate things like cleaning off the tag from the bottom of here, it's useful for that. And that scraping noise where the tag is goes away, and it becomes a smooth noise when the tag's gone. Before I bend this up, something that came up in the chat after last night's session was talking about these tiny little holes. I don't know if you remember, when we started off, I went round and used one of these 5-sided cutting broaches to open out these big holes to fit the axle bearings in. These holes are actually etched just the right size for the wire that I'm using, but on your kits they might not be. So you may need to go round with an even tinier cutting broach. This one starts at 0.2 mil, and you just wiggle this through up to wherever you want it to be. That's about 0.3 millimeters halfway along this, and that's the right size for the nickel silver rod that we're going to use for the brake cross shaft. Probably what I should have done and what I'd recommend is, when you start off, after you've cleaned your etch and it's holed like this one, go round and clean out all these holes. So if you look, you've got 2 on the Morton side, 1 on the plain side of the brakes, and then the brake levers themselves, you've got holes there that need opening out, and these ones on the brake push rods, or in between the brake push rods, need opening out as well. And because you've got a nice big thing to get hold of, it's easier to do the broaching when it's in that state. Okay, so around my pliers, and for this you can just bend it up by eye. Wants to be 90-degree bend, and just check and tweak it and make sure it's the right one. The way this etch is designed, I've never had one which hasn't been a really good fit. So you can see those 2 little slots down there. There where this is going to fit. And if you just pop it in and wriggle it around, either with your fingertips or with tweezers, it just clicks into place. And once it's clicked into place, in fact, I'll turn it that way around, it'll be easier for you to see, we need to solder it. And there's 3 little holes etched in which were designed to put the solder in. So I'll get 3 little slices of solder, get some flux on my cocktail stick, and just 3 little bits there. It's quite interesting doing this soldering backwards so that you can see and I can't. So I'll just hold the iron in there, and the flux will take the solder underneath this plate of metal, That's a bit of a chunky salami slice that I got there, that one. And number 3. And for belt and braces, if you wanted to, you could sort of solder along this side as well and put a little seam in that joint, but it's not really necessary as long as it was in the right place in the first place. But I'll go on then, I'll do it just to show you. Another little salami slice, and this time, to be proper, I'll put the solder there rather than taking it on the iron. That goes in. You can put this all around and make a seam around it if you want, but it just needs to hold it in place basically, and the brake cross wire is going to hold it in place anyway. Okay, let's do one of these coupling mountings. We were chatting about couplings as people were joining the meeting, so I just need to snip through one of these, and this is a box which folds up, which it gives you a platform that's the right height for mounting couplings of whatever flavour you deem appropriate. As I mentioned, as people were waiting, I use electric couplings and they rotate in a little tube. So to this wagon, I've glued on with araldite some tiny little tubes that electric couplings will fit into. If you were using DG couplings, you could solder or glue the base of the DG couplings onto here, and they're the same height as the underneath of the buffer beams. So to fold these up, you just need to sort of tweak it up. It'd be easier to do it from underneath, actually. Just poke it out, fold up the first one to 90 degrees, and then with pliers, we've got 2 more folds, which need probably do about 45 degrees each. So this thing folds round, if you can see that folding round, and it folds back down on itself. Now, you've got to watch it when you solder this down. There's two ways of doing it. The easy way, which I could have done, or the hard way, which I'm going to do, because you've got to watch out for a little pip on here. When I chopped through the tag, it's left a pip, and if I put this flat, that pip would stop it sitting absolutely flat. So when I solder it, I'm going to make sure that pip goes over one of the holes in my soldering mat. Anyway, I just need to carry on folding this round and make right angles. It folds round, and then I don't know if you heard that click, but it clicks into place. There's 2 little slots in the side. Hold it up that way. These 2 little slots down there, and this slots into those slots. So from the other side, you can see it coming through, and you've got to make sure they're slotted in fully. Otherwise, the platform won't be level. It's a case of back onto the soldering board and 2 little bits of solder. So I'm going to put some flux in these corners where these ends are, and then make sure, as I said before, that that little tab is over a random hole in this board, and make sure it's in absolutely correctly. There it is, clicks in, and I can hold it and just angle it that way, and you can see what I'm doing. And then pick up the solder, blob on one side, makes a nice blob, and blob on the other side. Smart that round a bit more. That's it. Then, to file off that tab, on the top of the wagon, just file across and get rid of anything that's sticking up above floor level, because otherwise it's going to stop the floor of the wagon sitting down nicely. And if you really want to go to town, the other side of that tag is just on there. That's not doing anybody any harm, but you can poke your file through and get rid of it if you want to. Okay, so there's 2 of these. Obviously, I'll just do 1 for now. The other thing that we need to think about at this stage is this thing to go in this slot here, which is the dummy inside false buffer beam. So back to the etch, and we can find that false buffer beam on the edge. There are two of them. 1, 2. As usual, I'll just do one for time's sake, because time is marching on. Crikey, we've been nearly half an hour already. They do say time flies when you're having fun. Now, the important tag to get rid of on this is the one on the side that's going to go through the slot. So we shall get a nice file and file that. I'm just holding it in my pliers and filing along to get rid of it in a very cat-handed manner. And then, as before, that just needs to go in the slot and be held in place by the tweezers. And the tweezers can hold it vertically because it won't stay vertical by itself. And then I can get some flux along here and a crumb of solder, which I have just waiting there, and just make a nice little seam along here. Now, we haven't talked about bodies today, and I'm going to say more about bodies tomorrow, but this body that I had prepared, I've actually modified it in more ways than I admitted to yesterday. I've also cut a little slot up the buffer beam. And if you aren't going to use DG couplings, if you're going to use something like an AJ or an Electra or 3 links or something, you can actually solder in the coupling hook that's on the edge. And I'll do that now, just to show you how it would go. So this cuts off here. Actually, yeah, easier if I cut it this way around, and cuts off there. And the length of this is such that if you poke it through the hole in the cosmetic buffer beam until the tail end of it touches that coupling mounting plate, that leaves it the right length. So again, just a little dab of flux on there, and I'm going to hold it, try and see if I can do this without getting it wonky. Hold it with my tweezers straight like that. Then bring in some solder from on top. Hopefully that solder will go where it needs to go. The flux will take it. What will happen is, oh, I've soldered it on upside down. Can you believe it? This is the pressure of live TV, folks. Right, so if you solder that on like that, the wagon body will go on top. The hook will go through the slot that I cut, and it'll look absolutely ridiculous being upside down, but I'll take that out and put it the right way up later on. Okay, to move on from there, here is one that I did earlier where I folded up both coupling mounts, put on both buffer beams and put on both couplings. And what we've got left to do now is just to add the brakes, which is a little bit of origami. But I'm looking at the time and we've been going for over half an hour, so I think brakes should probably be left until tomorrow because they will take a few minutes to explain. But if you want something to look forward to, this is the sort of folded up bit of nickel silver magic that we need to build for the brake levers.